New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to explore the relationship between the erotic, the esoteric, and religion. With me is Professor Jeffrey Krempel, who is professor of religion at Rice University and the author of several significant books, including Kali's Child, The Mystical and the Erotic in the Life and Teachings of Ramakrishna, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion, The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on the Study of Religion, Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal and the Sacred, Comparing Religions, Mutants and Mystics, Science Fiction, Superhero Comics, and the Paranormal, and written with Whitley Strieber, The Supernatural, a new vision of the unexplained, and most recently, Secret Body, erotic and esoteric currents in the history of religion. Once again, this is an interview conducted via Skype, so I'll switch over now to the Skype video. Welcome, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, and likewise. We got two Jeffs here.
Yeah. I'll remember which one I am.
Okay, I'm not sure I will. Let's go ahead anyway.
Okay. Well, you've written this magnificent book, Secret Body, which is an English translation of the phrase Corpus Mysticum. And in it, you're talking about your whole career as a scholar of the history of religion and how it seems so important to you to focus on two topics that are probably the most taboo in academia, the paranormal and the erotic.
Right. So, yeah, I spent the first really 25 years of my search, actually, and my career thinking about the relationship between mysticism and eroticism. So that was really all I did for a quarter of a century. And then I felt like I had answered those questions, at least to my own satisfaction. And I moved into other questions, which really revolved around the relationship between mind and matter, and looking at paranormal phenomena as guideposts or suggestions about how to think about that. And so Secret Body, which comes really, 13 years later, is a way of trying to put those two halves of my thought together. And, I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But that's really what the book was about, is trying to make sense of myself, but also trying to relate these two halves of my obsessions.
Well, it strikes me that not only are these two halves, the esoteric or paranormal and the erotic, both highly taboo, particularly in academia, but to me, they represent opposite poles of some sort of a spectrum. On the one hand, you have the carnal, and on the other hand, you have the very spiritual, or the idea of at least consciousness separate from the body.
Yeah. So in the first half of my work, I'm really trying to look at the relationship between sexual experience and mystical experience, which are those two halves again. And I'm essentially arguing they're not actually separate. And I know lots of people want to read the sexual language metaphorically, but it actually doesn't work if you really dig down deep enough. It's pretty obvious in close case studies that these aren't just metaphors. Mm-hmm. And with the paranormal stuff, people want to just frame it as some kind of fantasy or some kind of projection. But I also think that's a mistake, and that it really involves physical events, and it really involves mental states. And the fact that just completely throws our categories into disarray is precisely why it interests me. I think that's just fascinating, and I'm drawn to that kind of confusion.
Your first exposure to religious mysticism and its erotic overtones came when you were a seminary student. I guess that would be right out of high school.
Right. That was between 1981 and 1985. And I would have been 18 when I entered and 22 when I left. So yeah, that was my college experience. And it really was my introduction to these questions in a kind of very embodied and suffering way, frankly. Mm-hmm. I was anorexic. I was deeply anorexic. And I was also living in a religious community that over a number of years I came to understand is primarily a gay community, not in any explicit or expressed way, but in a kind of sublimated spiritual way. And I myself was not gay, but I was deeply confused sexually, and the anorexia was a part of that. And so me working through all of that with actually a psychoanalyst who was a monk as well was really the origins of my thinking along these lines.
So you had an early exposure to Freud.
I did. Freud saved my life, literally. And I don't mean that metaphorically either. I think I would have died in my mid-20s of starvation or something coming out of the anorexia if Freud and psychoanalysis wouldn't have turned that around.
You, in effect, cured yourself of anorexia.
That's faithful to Freud too. Yeah, uh-huh. I think that's fair. Yeah, it wasn't just me though. I don't think I could have done that without the analyst. But you're right. That's how psychoanalysis works. Yeah.
And Freud had a lot of ideas both about the erotic and about the esoteric and about mysticism.
Right. Freud was actually fascinated by religion in general and was much more sympathetic to mysticism than people realize. One of my colleagues here at Rice, it was Bill Parsons, who really is the guy who showed us that Freud was deeply, deeply impacted by this French writer named Romain Rolland. And Rolland was himself an open mystic, had been raised Catholic, had really left Catholicism, and had developed a kind of worldview, I think, that we would now call spiritual but not religious. But himself was deeply mystically inclined, and he wrote Freud after Freud wrote The Future of an Illusion and was a big fan of Freud, and they became very, very close. And Rolland tried to teach Freud about the mystical, and of course Freud taught Rolland about the human psyche, and they were dear, dear friends. Freud adored him and was very humble about what he knew and didn't know about mystical experience.
And yet people today think of Freud and mysticism as the notion of a return to the oceanic state of the infant, as sort of a regression, not a state of transcendence.
Well, that was part of what Freud thought. I mean, that's fair to that part of Freud. That certainly is fair. But there was this whole other part to Freud that he acknowledged that Rolland had a set of experiences that he didn't have. And as he said, I don't have ears for that kind of music, but he acknowledged that other people do. So I think Freud is more complicated. I don't want to portray him as some kind of hero of the mystical. He wasn't, but that's also not why he saved me, by the way. I think with all great thinkers, we can acknowledge their greatness without signing our names to the absolute truth of everything they said and thought, which is just silly. It's just silly. And I think Freud is one of those people who just so shaped our modern world and in such powerful ways that we are foolish to ignore that.
Mm-hmm. Well, after your time at the seminary, you became a scholar and you began exploring the tantric tradition of India, and in particular the life of the 19th century Hindu saint Ramakrishna.
Right. So when I came out of the seminary, I had essentially left the religious life really on the grounds that I could not find any resources for a male heterosexual mystical life. In other words, there was no way to be a straight guy and be a Catholic mystic, because the Catholic mystic is always called to marry Christ, which is a very homoerotic thing if you happen to be a man.
Yeah. I know in your book you have a quote from a bumper sticker that says, "Real men love Jesus." Yeah,
and of course they didn't intend it the way I intend that, but that's kind of the dilemma of male heterosexuality, at least in Catholicism. And so I was interested in Hinduism and Buddhism because there are all these goddesses, and which seemed like a real resource for such a heterosexual mystical life. And so that's what took me to graduate school, and that's why I wrote that dissertation and first book, which was on the life of Ramakrishna, who turned out not to be straight at all. And that was sort of the irony of the project, was I went looking for a straight mystic and found another homoerotic mystic like I had seen, a dozen times over in my own tradition.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I recall, he was rather well known for dressing in women's clothing.
Well, he would take on, he didn't cross-dress in that sense that we think of today, but he took on the personalities or bhavas of various female figures from Hindu mythology in order to ecstatically love Krishna, for example. So he definitely had this transgendering going on but that had a very established place in Hindu religion and spirituality. And so I was trying to tease all of that out in the book. And in what sense is this traditional Hinduism? In what sense does this depend on a certain sexual orientation? And can we even tease those things apart at the end of the day?
Mm-hmm. Well, before we go too much further, it'd probably be useful for some of our viewers who are not familiar with Ramakrishna to talk about his place in the history of religion.
Well, so he lived from 1836 to 1886. He was living in Calcutta of the time, which was sort of the center of British colonialism. It was one of the focal points where Indian intellectuals were engaging British colonialists and intellectuals. And one of the things that was coming out of that was a refashioning of what would become modern Hinduism. And his main disciple was a young man named Narendra, who became Swami Vivekananda, particularly when he came to the U.S. And spoke at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. So, and it was really Vivekananda who, in some sense, was the first kind of super missionary from Hinduism to Western culture, and was really talking and writing about Vedanta, a kind of philosophical form of Hinduism that emphasizes non-dualism. And so that's very much a part of how Hinduism was received, particularly in the States in the late 19th and early 20th century. So Ramakrishna was very, very, very influential through Vivekananda, but also then through a collection of books that were translated in 1942 as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is really how most people encountered him in the counterculture, for example.
Mm-hmm. I remember when I first moved to California, people were into the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and I seem to recall some of my friends saying, and he smoked hashish.
And he what?
Smoked hashish.
Oh, I don't know about that, actually. Yeah, that could be some oral folklore developing. I mean, there's certainly lots of hashish in India, no question about that. But I don't actually recall that piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you were in India, working on the study of the tantric traditions there and Ramakrishna, you yourself had a very profound experience.
Right. So I was working on a form of Hinduism called Shakta Tantra. And this is a tantric tradition, very, very influential in West Bengal. It focuses around the goddess Kali, and it involves this, the presence of something called Shakti, mm-hmm. which is a kind of mystical energy that's also conscious. It was the fall of 1989, and it was during a festival called Kali Puja, which is a series of days dedicated to the worship of Kali. And during that festival, I woke up one morning and I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. And while I was trying to figure out what had happened, this energy came out of me, or came out of the room, or came out of somewhere, and started to engage me in all of these really profound ways. And that I thought I was being electrocuted, actually. I thought I was dying, maybe having a heart attack. It wasn't clear. And then at one point, these energies they sort of imploded right into the heart region. And I had this kind of classic out-of-body experience. And then struggled for some time to try to get back into my body. And when I got back into the body, I felt this Shakti. I felt this conscious energy that was, kind of coursing through me. And that was really the inspiration for the dissertation and the book. I mean, it's called Kali's Child because of that experience of being invaded or possessed or radiated by the goddess's Shakti.
Mm-hmm. Now, this experience has now happened several decades ago. It obviously still seems to be with you in many ways.
Well, of course, after it happened, for years after it happened, I thought that the whole point of it was to somehow arrive at some correct interpretation of it, or to get it back. Mm-hmm. And I wrote book after book after book trying to figure out what this thing was, or this presence was, until, a few years ago, I came to the conclusion that the point of that event was actually all the books that I wrote. That there was no single interpretation of it. It had no single meaning. That it was designed to be a kind of paradox, and that it was designed to set me on all of these paths that I later went down. So I see it now as sort of infinitely meaningful, and not placeable, mm-hmm. not definable in any clear or final sense. And I also don't try to I've failed completely to get it back. I mean, I don't think I was capable of causing it in the first place, but I certainly can't get it back. So I've let go of that as well. And I think I'm sort of at peace with it at the moment.
It does strike me that you're talking about something like a personal relationship with a divine form of the feminine.
Certainly in that case, absolutely. Yeah. And remember, I was in search of a heterosexual mysticism, so you need a divine feminine, right? Yeah. to do that. So I think that's fair. Mm-hmm. I think that's fair.
And later on in your career, you co-authored this book with Whitley Strieber on the supernatural. And what you emphasize, I think, is that Whitley's experience with what he called the visitors also resonated with this idea of a personal relationship with something akin to the divine feminine.
Well, not only that, I mean, when I listen to Whitley and when I look at the artwork that comes out of that, I mean, I see Hindu goddesses, I see Tantra,
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, it's not, because there's no American or Western category for any of that, but basically you have almond-eyed female deities engaging people in sexual and spiritual transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much what Shakti Tantra is in India, So I'm not saying they're the same thing at all, but they clearly share. There's something shared there
Mm-hmm.
that I can't quite figure out.
Well, for example, Whitley describes the visitors sometimes as being very enticing and erotic, and at other times being very fierce, performing unwelcome surgical operations on him. And then on the other hand, you have all these images of Kali holding knives and swords and bloody heads, and in a very, very, in fact, surrealistic, fierce aspect.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you only have read about Tantra in books, you are not prepared to encounter it in India, particularly go into a cremation ground and meet practicing tantrikas who are, there with skulls and candles, and it's a place of literally burning bodies. I mean, this is not something simple. But Jeff, when I was trained in the study of religion at Chicago in the late 80s and 90s, what we meant by the sacred, which comes out of people like Rudolf Otto and others, is not the good. The sacred is about power. Mm. And the human response to the sacred historically, wherever you look, from the Bible to modern India, is one of fascination and terror.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just walk up to God and shake his hand in the Bible. If you see God or you touch God, you're dead. Mm-hmm. So this is not a force of pure benevolence. This is a force of certainly beauty and power and redemption, but also terror and violence and death if you get too close. And so for me, that what I saw in India was not completely foreign at all. I mean, it was quite faithful to this larger global encounter with the sacred.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose one might say there is a sense that the mainstream religious institutions, the churches and synagogues and even the mosques, I suppose and temples, serves as a way of sheltering the average person from that awesome, terrible thing we call God.
Right. So, one of the things I often try to describe in my work is that, a temple, particularly a temple that claims to house the divine, is, more like a nuclear reactor than anything. It's designed to protect the community from the sacred, but also to get a little of that sacred juice and, put it into the power lines for the community. So it's always this sort of both and. It's like, religious traditions take essentially this nuclear reaction, and they press it down into this little wire or this little source of energy that can be used for domestic or daily purposes. But you don't want to walk into the reactor. You're toast if you do that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you do argue, I think, especially for your colleagues who are historians of religion, such as yourself, that they have to appreciate the potential of the reactor, not just the 9-volt battery.
Right. Because you can see those encounters as well. I mean, I think these historical revelations are, people getting closer to the reactor, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And you're suggesting that one way that mainstream scholars can better understand what religion is all about is to take the 150-year history of paranormal research seriously instead of sweeping it under the rug as they tend to do.
Right. So there's a little kind of a backstory here. When I was writing a history of the human potential movement in about 205, 206, finishing it up, and became this book on Esalen, this community down in Big Sur. And while I was finishing that, I was talking to all these people who were telling me all of these incredible stories of things that were just completely unbelievable to me. But I trusted the people, and I knew them personally. And I was just deeply puzzled by why my colleagues and I really had no way of even thinking about these things. We would talk about them as legends or as folklore or as exaggerations or whatever, but we never really took them seriously. And so I wrote a history of the paranormal called Authors of the Impossible, and it was it was therapy for me, trying to work through why we had denied all this. And essentially what I found is that when the field was founded in the 19th century, its founders were all fascinated by these things. Mm. And then over the 20th century, they gradually get taken off the table. And the more they get taken off the table, the more, of course, on the table that we can explain. So we get to a point where, we're saying, well, we understand everything about religion. It all makes good rational sense. And of course it makes good rational sense because we've taken everything off the table we can't explain. And so what I've been trying to do over the last 10 years is put all that crazy stuff back on the table and say, okay, folks, now what? Yeah. And of course we can't explain this. But I think what's so useful, this is what you were talking about, is if we get up close to that stuff in the present through people like Whitley or Elizabeth Crone, this woman I just finished this other book with, if we get up really close to it, or if we take our own anomalous experiences seriously, we can then use those contacts and use those experiences to better understand the historical materials that actually now don't look so unbelievable. They might still be exaggerated, and they're shaped and they're formed and domesticated, of course. But at the origin of them, I think we can often find the same sorts of experiences that are all around us today in people reporting things like near-death experiences and apparitions of dead loved ones and UFO encounters and, you name it. It's all here in the present, just as it was in the past. And we can use the present to understand the past, and vice versa, frankly. We can use the past to understand the present.
There are many scholars these days who are exploring the paranormal, and I think I would count you among them, who are saying we really have to consider an idealistic metaphysics, a metaphysics that places consciousness first, rather than a reductionistic, materialistic metaphysics. And in your writing, you seem to suggest that metaphysical materialism is really the basis of the whole academic study of religion.
Yeah. So this is, again, at the core of my critique. I think that the metaphysics that most academics operate with is some combination of Marxism and materialism. And by that I mean they think that all human experience is somehow a product of economics and politics and matter, and that's it. And so then that determines what they're willing to look at. of course. And that's how you get the table that I was talking about earlier, where everything makes sense because we've just controlled what we put on that table. And I think when you look at extreme religious experiences, not ordinary, I'm not talking about going to church or the temple or the synagogue one day a week. I'm talking about people who are receiving revelations or who are being abducted or whatever the language is. If we look at those experiences, it's very, very hard. I think it's impossible, actually, to make sense of them with just a materialist metaphysic. Mm-hmm. I think we need something that certainly embraces what materialism gives us, but also can move beyond it. And so, that's what I've been trying to do. Idealism, of course, is the other extreme. And I know people, I deeply admire people who are idealists, and they may be right. But I wouldn't describe myself as an idealist, Jeffrey.
Okay.
If we want to get really technical, I'm a dual aspect monist, which is essentially a system that says that reality itself is neither mental nor material. It participates in both of those things. But when it comes up into a human being like you or me, and it comes into our experience, it splits off into a material dimension and a mental dimension, but that those two dimensions are actually the same thing that is being split off. So it's ontologically one, but it's epistemologically two. And I think that's closer to where I'm at the moment anyway. And so, but that helps me explain paranormal experiences, because paranormal experiences always have this physical dimension in the environment that corresponds perfectly or almost perfectly to some mental state. And so for me, that if they've split off of the common, super reality, that's exactly what you'd expect to see. And of course, that is what you see if you take these things seriously.
Well, let's talk for a moment about deities.
Okay.
We've been discussing Shakti and Kali and the relationship of the divine feminine to the idea of masculine heterosexual mysticism. They seem to be quite natural. I know ever since I was a child, I thought it would be much easier to have a relationship with a female deity than a male.
Right.
And Whitley Strieber is an interesting figure because he now is writing about experiences that go back for decades in which he has had encounters, and it's still not clear to me whether to the extent to which you could call these encounters physical or to the extent in which they might be metaphysical or even fantasy. But one thing is very clear in Whitley's case. He's had an enormous impact. People all over the world now identify these large almond eyes with aliens. And about 6 months ago, I had the privilege of interviewing a fellow who was a student of yours, Jason Giorgiani, and we were talking about Whitley. And he said, this man is imbued with Shakti power, the way he's been able to change the thinking of the intelligent or the Western world, people who read his books, which are now millions of people, into thinking about alien beings as real. That whatever these beings are, Whitley himself is an instrument of Shakti.
Right. So I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, that's a mythical way of talking about Whitley, of course, but I think these experiences lend themselves almost by force or willy-nilly to mythical ways of speaking. I mean, the way I think of Whitley, whom I know very well and admire profoundly, is he's a shaman essentially. He's in contact with other dimensions of reality that the rest of us are not. I'm certainly not. But that he lives in a culture that doesn't recognize shamanism. So he's in a real dilemma, actually. He's a profoundly gifted shaman in a culture that has no shamans. And so he tends to be seen as a crank or or as someone who's making this up. This is what his critics would say. And he's not. He's not making this up. These things really happen to him. And he's trying his best to express to us what he is experiencing. And he does that both through fiction and nonfiction. But he's really working against the grain of this kind of scientistic culture we all live in. So that's how I would understand someone like Whitley Strieber.
It's been over half a century now since Carl Jung wrote his book on flying saucers, in which he suggested that the flying saucer phenomena is really, we're witnessing the birth of a religious movement, and I think you've taken it that way.
Yeah. So I just taught Jung's book, actually. The book's called Flying Saucers, A Myth of Things Seen in the Sky, is the actual title. And Jung, this is right at the end of Jung's life. I think he came out in 58 or so with this book. And what's so interesting about the book is it's very prescient in a lot of ways. And he can't decide whether the flying saucer phenomena is a kind of projected fantasy and is based on some kind of archetypal process, or whether these are actual ships and technology. And he sort of decides that indecision is the point of the phenomena, and that what the UFO phenomena really signals is the end of one era. It has a kind of apocalyptic function, and the beginning of another. And I think there's something to that, actually. I'm not an apocalyptic thinker, but I think the sense of one great Western mythology ending and another one beginning is essentially true. And I think that was really behind a lot of Jung's thinking, and a lot of his thought, actually.
Well, many other great thinkers have suggested as much. I've been very influenced by the writings of Pitirim Sorokin at Harvard, who suggested that we're witnessing the end of an age that started in the Renaissance 500 years ago, and it sort of played itself out, and something new is trying to be born, but in the meantime, things are going to be very chaotic.
Yeah, things don't end nicely, usually.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I know we're just scratching the surface, however. I wonder if it's possible to push a little deeper. For example, I get the impression from your recent book that what is separating us from access to that part of ourselves, which is more attuned to paranormal or esoteric realities, is we become so heavily acculturated, and we can break through that acculturation. It happens in moments of extreme stress, or it can happen in moments of extreme ecstasy, and that's where I think the erotic comes in.
Right. So Jeffrey, I'm not sure what you're asking there.
It's not a question, actually. Yeah. It's sort of like a jazz riff, and now it's your turn to play the trombone.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'll riff. I can play the trombone. I often have this conversation that goes like this. A lot of religious practice and a lot of assumptions around spirituality assume that, the goal of life is moving to the suburbs and having 2.5 kids and a golden retriever and, having a nice retirement account. And all of those are good things, all of which, of course, I want as well. Maybe not the 2.5 kid. The half kid is disturbing. But actually, when you look at these experiencers, the great experience almost never happens in a state of health or normality or high social functioning. It usually takes some kind of trauma or some kind of incursion or some kind of breakthrough. And And so I think we have to be, we have to stop thinking that all truth and all good things come through normality. I don't think that's true. And so when someone says to me, oh, such and such an abduction case must be related to some kind of psychopathology or illness or something, my response is, well, duh, of course, often it is, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Mm-hmm. There's no, I think of the human being as a kind of filter, and that what the body and the brain does when it's healthy is it keeps out most of reality. But if you operate with that model, you have to somehow compromise or shut down the filter for the rest of reality to get in. Mm-hmm. And this is why, something like an erotic experience, an orgasm, or a psychedelic substance, or a car wreck, or a lightning strike, something really that breaks you open is what lets in the cosmos, right? So I'm not encouraging that. I'm not trying to tell people to go, drive their Toyota into oak trees or something. But I'm just saying, look, life is going to traumatize us anyway, but let's look for these incursions of the transcendent in these moments. Mm-hmm. And let's not keep pretending that the transcendent is somehow the normal mm-hmm. or the everyday, because it's not. It's just not. Like, I get really upset. I don't get upset. I get pissed when people say, "Oh, the paranormal is normal." I'm like, no, it's not. Have you ever had a paranormal experience? It's freaking eerie. It is weird. Have you ever talked to someone who has had one? They're terrified. It is not the normal. Stop talking like that. So this is kind of what I'm trying to get at is if we can have bigger imaginations and bigger hearts and not keep pretending that God or the transcendent or whatever our language is compatible with our everyday ordinary functioning, I think we'll be much better off, actually. Mm-hmm. And we'll understand ourselves better.
Well, that seems to be the key point. It's about understanding ourselves, because I think at the end of the day, you maintain, and I would agree whether you maintain this or not, I would agree, but the point you're saying is that this awesome, terrifying experience of God is also an experience of ourselves.
Yes, I am saying that. I have never encountered a religious experience that was not the religious experience of a human being. Ever. So to me, that the most accurate thing you can say about God or any religious deity or state is that it is somehow related to what we call the human being. And the human being is not what we think it is. I think that's the flip side here, is that we are way weirder than we put on. We're all Superman or Superwoman, and we just think we're Clark Kent, but we're not, or we are. We're both of those things. Mm-hmm. And that's this is sort of the beginning of our conversation. Yeah. That's sort of my point is, no, actually we're both. But usually we're just aware of the ordinary self, of the ego. But sometimes that gets, Superman shows up.
Mm-hmm. And if it shows up at the right time and place, it can change your life.
Totally, completely, and instantly. Yeah. This is not to press a book, but I just finished this book. It's called Changed in a Flash. I wrote it with Elizabeth Crone. And that's the whole point of the book is, actually, you can be changed just like that, in an instant.
She had a near-death experience, I believe.
Takes a lightning strike in this case. Yeah. I don't again encourage, but, it happened to Elizabeth, mm-hmm. and it happens to people all the time,
Well, Jeffrey Kripal, it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. I'm delighted to be able to share it with our viewers, and I look forward to future opportunities to do this again.
Great. I'm happy to have those conversations.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.